Okay. So what Perek Dalet really deals with is the structure of government and the way you organize the nation. But it starts out with a very simple statement. Vayhi Melech Shlomo, Melech al Kol Yisrael. The Melech Shlomo, King Solomon, was the king over all of the Jewish people. Now, this is not an unusual statement. We had the same kind of statement back in Shmuel Bet in Perek Chet, Pasuk Tetvav, when David HaMelech moved from Hebron and up to Yerushalayim, that he also was the king over all of Israel. It's a statement saying very simply that now is the time that everyone was together. And so that, in a sense, he achieved what David had done, but he achieved it 7.5 years earlier in his reign. And that is a significant accomplishment. And that's the statement of the Radak. Rashi, however, ties this in to the previous parak, and Rashi says, no, after everyone had witnessed his great wisdom, then there was no question that they were all going to follow him. That when they all saw that wisdom, they all rejoiced in it, and they were all behind it. And now we come, after this first pasuk, to the first of two segments of the parak, which seem very, very technical and at times somewhat frustrating. And the reason why is because it's really just a question of lists. The first list being the list of the various officers within his monarchy, and the second being a list of the regions, the way he had divided the country itself. And so the first list starts out, Ve'ela hasarim asher lo, these are the officers, the ministers, who were for Shlomo, and the first was Azaryahu ben Sadok HaKohen. The very first was Azaryahu. Now, Azaryahu, notice, doesn't have any title. It doesn't tell you what he is. True, he's a Kohen, but this HaKohen is just part of his name. And so it could be, and this is what the Daf Mikra says, is that maybe HaKohen is a title, but not serving as a Kohen, because we'll see that in a moment, but rather that he was the chief of staff, that he was a step ahead of everyone. He was over all of the rest of the ministers. Whereas Asher Weiser in his piece says, no, his position was a Kohen. But later on in a couple of psukim, we're going to see that there were two Kohanim. So what's his role? And so Weiser suggests, listen, maybe he was in some way a priest, but he wasn't the Kohen Gadol. He had some kind of secondary function within the Kuna itself. The Abarbanel, though, takes a different approach. And what the Abarbanel says very simply is that what this is actually tied into the next pasuk, because the very next pasuk says, Alichorev v'achiyah b'nei shisha sofrim. It doesn't have any kind of introduction. It seems as if there wasn't a period at the end of pasuk bet, it would just flow right into pasuk gimel. And so the Abarbanel says that's because pasuk bet does flow right into pasuk gimel. There were actually 3 sofrim, he suggests. There were 3 scribes. Now these aren't simply, people who were writing things down. These are people who were in charge of the records. So one of the sofrim was responsible for law. Another sofer, and this is the Abarbanel says, was responsible for the treasury. And a third sofer was responsible for the archives, for all of the correspondence of the king himself. And then after that, it says, Yehoshaphat ben Achilud HaMaskir. Yehoshaphat was the one who was the maskir. Now, maskir is secretary. However, maskir also can be much more. And maskir, according to Rashi, he was the one who determined who had access to Shlomo. Because he was the one who decided you get to go in and you don't get to go in. Weiser, basing himself on an earlier piece when it talked about David HaMelech and Perek Chet and Shmuel Bet, says no. So Fair is actually, the maskir is actually the one who's responsible for the Sefer HaZichronot, for the chronicles of the king himself. So we're not fully sure of what that response was, but definitely these were people who kept track of records of some nature. Uvenayahu ben Yoyada Tzava. And Benayahu was over the army. Now, when we say that Benayahu was over the army, very simply, the Daf Mikra says that it's important to notice where this is at, and I'll get to it in a moment with just a chart, which I'll show you, of where Benayahu sits in Shlomo HaMelech's monarchy. But keep that in mind. And afterwards, with Tzadok ve'Evyatar Kohanim. Tzadok and Evyatar were both Kohanim. Now, the problem with this is, back in Perek Bet, if you recall, Evyatar was exiled. Evyatar had shown a mistake in his loyalty. He'd won with Adoniyahu, and and Shlomo HaMelech had exiled him and said, stay away. So why would Evyatar be mentioned there? So the Radak takes a fascinating approach. He says, it's a different Evyatar. There was more than one Evyatar Kohen. This was a different Evyatar. That Evyatar was still in exile. The Rikaspi actually says, no, he's still listed. It's the same Evyatar, but he's in a secondary role, whereas the Ralbag says that actually there was a certain amount of time that they shared responsibilities. That actually there were times when Evyatar would step in and fill in for Tzadok himself. Va'azaryahu ben Natan ala Nitzavim. The next role in the government was Azaryahu. Azaryahu was over the Nitzavim. Now, the Nitzavim were the people who were going to be assigned to collect taxes throughout the country. So he was responsible for all of that. He was, in a sense, in charge of these matters of internal state matters. V'zavud ben Natan Kohen Re'ah HaMelech. And then you have an interesting piece where you have this new role, the friend of the king. Zavud ben Natan was the friend of the king. He was the person who was always with David HaMelech. He was David HaMelech's sounding board for him, according to the Mitzudat David. Va'achishar alabayit. Achishar was responsible for the matters of the palace. Va'adoniram ben Avda alamas. And Adoniram was ultimately over all of the taxes. He was the one, and this kind of tax is a different kind of tax we would normally consider. Rashi takes the approach that his responsibility of tax was over the labor tax, which we're going to see very soon in the next parak when we're talking about the responsibilities of building both the Beit HaMikdash and then afterwards the palaces. All of these things, he was going to be responsible to be able to bring the manpower forward to take care of those responsibilities. Now, in addition to this organization of government, Shlomo also had 12 governors who were responsible for different regions. Now, before I go to that, I'm going to share with you a screen. And just for a moment, this is one of the handouts that I gave you. Give me one moment. And this is the screen I want you to look at. Now, on this screen, what's fascinating about this, and this is actually Moshe Garcia in the Olam HaTanakh addresses this question, is trying to compare the two organizations of government between David HaMelech and Shlomo HaMelech. If you notice with David HaMelech, the top position was Yoav. Mentioned twice, okay? We have it once in Perek Chet in Shmuel Bet and once in Perek Chaf in Shmuel Bet. Yoav was over all of the armies. Versus David HaMelech, who starts out with this person Azaryahu HaKohen. And if you look at the roles, you begin to understand, Garcia suggests, the agenda of the king. Shlomo HaMelech's agenda is we had this first person who was called the Kohen. And again, remember, it's somewhat ambiguous what specifically was the role of the Kohen. It could have been that he was one of the Sofrim. It could have been, again, one who was responsible over all of the other ministers. It could have been that he served in some priestly function, but he was up there. Then you had the Sofrim, the people who took care of, according to the Abarbanel, those three different functions of government, be responsible for the correspondence, be responsible over the treasury, be responsible as well for the law. Then you have the person who is considered the Maskir, okay? He's the one who's the chief of staff figuring out who's going to come in. And only afterwards do you have Benayahu ben Yehoyada. wrote Garciel, and I actually have the quote here, and it's a little bit of fancy Hebrew and a little vague on the printing, so I'll apologize if I get something wrong. Wrong one. So actually, the wrong one. I'm sorry, picking the wrong quote. So I'll take a different piece from this. What Garciel says is that the agenda had changed between Shlomo and David. David HaMelech, up front, military was the issue because he was a conqueror. He was constantly at war, and so Yoav had this massive role. Shlomo HaMelech's role, no, was organization of governments. And so on top of his governments were people who were responsible for structure, both the structure of access, the structure of all of the rules. And only later is Benayahu down. The role of the military leader has diminished in Shlomo HaMelech's court, and the reason is because he's not as necessary as he had been for David HaMelech. And this you see pretty clearly, and it is, by the way, color-coded on this chart. If you notice this tan color versus the tan color that's all the way down here on the left side, and the same thing with the other roles, you see how they all play out. Go back to the chart, and now what happens is now, after you see the structure of the ministers, the next thing you get to see is the structure of the geography. And again, this is going to be a fascinating change between Shlomo and David. V'li Shlomo 12 nitzavim al kol Yisrael. Shlomo had these 12 people, these governors, over all of the Jewish people. Now, again, I gave you a handout for this. If you didn't print it out, I will share the screen again. This is this screen, okay? He had this screen, and again, if you notice, we're going to start. Do you see my cursor when I have the arrow around? You see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Har Ephraim. I'm just trying to see if I can do this. Excuse me one moment. Give me one more second. Sorry. Oh, here it is. Okay. So we're going to start right here with Har Ephraim. Okay. And the Shnei Maser Nitzivim al Kol Yisrael had a specific task. V'chilkelu et hamelech v'beito chodesh b'shana yeh al kol ha'achad l'cholkel. There are going to be 20. There are going to be 12 of them. Because there are 12 of them, each one had the responsibility to provide for the king 1 month out of the year. So their region was significant. Ve'ela shmotam, and here are their names. The very first one is a name that we're very familiar with. His name was Ben-Hur. Now, the reason we're familiar with Ben-Hur is because Ben-Hur in English is Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, Mitzudot says very simply, who he was not significant at all. He got the job from Protectia. His father was the important guy. And in fact, when you look, there are various relationships that are pointed out in the text itself between some of these governors and Shlomo HaMelech. And so it is interesting, but there was an element of some form of Protectia. It doesn't mean that he wasn't the most qualified, but Ben-Hur was a person whose father had been important, and so his name is really not necessary. Then came part 2, okay, and part 2 was Ben Deker b'Makatzu v'Shalavim u'Beit Shemesh. We're now moving over here in this area. Makatz is most likely a region versus Shalavim that we know very well. You notice here's Shalavim, okay, and Beit Shemesh is right here, and Ve'elon Beit Hanan, and Elon is right, it's probably right here as well. These are significant cities within those regions. Again, if we're talking about taxes, it's important you have significant cities because that's the source we are able to tax. Ben Deker again, who he was, we don't know. We know who his father was named Deker. And his father was the reason he got the job. Ben Chesed Ba'arubot. Now the region of Arubot, right here, belonged to Ben Chesed. And Ben Chesed had that Arubot, Lo, Socho, V'chol Eretz Chefer. And he had Socho, which is here, and the whole area of Chefer as well. And this is the area apparently right here in the middle of Chefer. Ben Avinadav, Kol Nafet Dor. Ben Avinadav had this whole area. And this area, if you notice where we are today, this up here is Haifa. Okay, here's the Har Carmel, it's Haifa. Here's Dor. He had this area of Dor. Tafat bat Shlomo haita lo leisha. And interestingly, he had also one other element of protexia. He was Shlomo HaMelech's son-in-law, who was responsible for this place as well. And the Abarbanel says that apparently the way it's written, if you notice, haita lo, in that kind of sense, it seems to be, according to the Abarbanel, that he only married into Shlomo's family afterwards. So maybe the protexia was elsewhere. Again, notice he doesn't have a first name, so his father must have been somebody significant. Ba'ana ben Achilud ta'anachu Megiddo. Now the next section of area was here, the Tanakh Megiddo schedule, this area, and this one Ba'ana has. Ba'ana is the first one we have a real name on. V'chol Beit Shan, and he had the whole area of Beit Shan, which is here, this area here. Asher Eitzel Tzartana, which is right near Tzartan, mitachat Israel mi Beit Shan, ad Avel Mechola. And it went all the way down. Here's Avel Mechola. Went all the way down, and it went all the way up. It's a very strange area. And if you look at that very strange area, it's an area that is gerrymandered. Okay, we know this from Chicago very well. Look at the shape of the space. Okay, it starts up here, and it then schleps all the way down here, and it continues to go down, and it goes across like this. And I will apologize for one moment. I'm going to mute everyone for just one.
Yes. He changed his screen. He put the show in the background. He even put on the Florida screen for a minute just to show what you can do. Right. When you, I'll come in maybe after 10 o'clock. I'll try to come in after 10 o'clock.
Okay, I apologize. If you notice, this area is gerrymandered. And that's also significant and will play a role. We'll see at the end. We'll try to explain why that all happens. Pasuk Yud Gimel, Ben Gever Beramot Gilad. Now, Ramot Gilad is on the other side of the Yarden. It's over here. If you notice, the area we're talking about, they've captured more land than they used to have apparently before. Lo Chavot Yair. Chavot Yair is a very significant area. We've known about that since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the end of the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ben Menashe, Asher Begilad, which was in the area of Gilad. Lo Chevel Argov, he has this whole area of Argov that's up here. Asher B'Bashan, Shishim Arim Gedolot Choma Bariach. There are 60 massive fortified cities with these gates and with these locks that are made out of copper. This was a sense of great wealth that existed in this entire area. What's interesting, though, if you look again at this area, it's so massive of an area. Lahavdil, I would suggest it's somewhat like Texas in the sense that you have this great natural resource in the area, but there's this massive area being spread out. And so that's why it's so big, because it's not that every place, it didn't have the same concentration of population as you would have in some of the others. Achimatz ben Naphtali. Now Achimatz is up here in Naphtali. Gam hu lakach et Basmat bat Shlomo leisha. And he also became a son-in-law of Shlomo HaMelech. Ba'ana ben Chushai ba'asher uva'alot. And then the next region is up here. Yehoshaphat ben Paruach b'Yisachar. And Yehoshaphat is over here. Now, if you notice, and this is again going to be significant, when we're talking about these various regions, most of the regions have not been tied into Shvatim. They've been gerrymandered areas. Asher is an area that was one, okay? This is one that's a Shevet. Naphtali is a Shevet. Yisachar maintains its Shevet identity as well. We'll see.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Well, he's got a son-in-law. He's 12 years old, and I presume that at this point he's 15. But where's the son-in-law? I mean, it doesn't. Something chronological is a problem.
Right, which is part of the reason why the Abarbanel. Well, first of all, there's two issues. The Abarbanel says it's later on. It didn't happen right away. then later on this person married into the family. So that's one simple answer. But remember also that the Abarbanel is of the position that he was older, that Shlomo HaMelech must have been in his 20s at this time. But even then, it's talking about a later time in history, because otherwise the chronology doesn't work. You're 100% right.
It really doesn't work at all.
Not at all. So that's why if you say these people took over, he was very young when Shlomo HaMelech took over, let's say he was in his 20s, these were the governors, they took over, and later on they married daughters of his, which is where the Abarbanel is coming from. Shimi ben Elah is in Binyamin, down here. Now, again, this is another tribe. So far we've identified 4 tribes. Then, Gever ben Uri be'eretz Gilad. Gever is down here in the Eretz Gilad, that's over here. Eretz Sichon, Melech HaAmori, Va'od Melech HaBashan. This is the area of Gibon and of Og and Sichon and Og. We've heard about them before. And then it says, Unetziv Achad Asher Ba'aretz. And there was one more. And he was the Netziv Echad. Now the problem with this idea of Netziv Echad, we don't know what it means. First of all, we don't know what the area is. We don't know what it means at all. And so as a result, the interesting possibility here is, if you look at the land of Israel, the area which hadn't been covered yet was Yehudah. And it could be, very simply, and this is a Gemara that Rashi quotes, that the Netziv Echad was a unique role, and it was a unique role who was over others, but also it could be, and here actually the Netziv Echad also comes to the fact, and Garcia says this, and also the Data Mikra says this as well, that one of these psukim that flow into the next. Netziv Echad Asher Ba'aretz Yehudah. That maybe he was responsible over this area of Yehudah. Because the tribe of Yehudah doesn't seem to have a regular number. The additional issue we have, though, is if you count up all the places, we started out by saying here are the 12 regions, and now we have 13, which is the reason why the Gemara says this Netziv Echad was responsible for all. It wasn't one of the regions, it was a super region over everything. Or the Gemara says, no, their responsibility was on the leap month. That whenever there was a leap year and there was an additional month, they would be the additional person. It's complicated. And the reason why it's complicated is if it's just a 13th, and if it, let's say it's just one extra month, well, isn't that favoring Yehudah? And isn't that asking for some level of danger to favor Yehudah? Something talking in the background. I ask if you mute yourself, please. Yehudah v'Yisrael rabim kechol asher al hayam larov ochlim v'shtotim usmechim is actually the very last pasuk. Yehudah and Yisrael are many. They're just like the sands of the sea. They are able to eat and drink and rejoice. Now, the role of Yehudah, we're not sure of 100%, and it is very, very complicated to say Yehudah had some special status. It may be that they had an additional status. Maybe they were organizing, but what about their tax systems, and why isn't that included? That's one of the challenges we're going to have to face, and it may be, by the way, you could say that this, again, was one of the mistakes that Shlomo might have made. There are 5 tribes, though, that are identified. You have Yehudah, you have Yisachar, you have Naphtali, you have Binyamin, and you have Asher. Those are where I put the check marks. What you don't have are the other 7 tribes. And so this is the piece I was going to read from you before by accident, where Garcia writes as follows. נראה שיש להסביר את החלוקה למחוזות על רקע מדיניות הפנים הכללית של דוד ושלמה. It must be that this division into regions versus shvatim describes also the internal politics of David versus Shlomo. שנועדה להחליש את המבנה הפטריארכלי-שבטי של החברה הישראלית מצד אחד, ולחזק את שיטת הממשל הריכוזית ממלכתית מצד שני. That what Shlomo HaMelech apparently was trying to do was to shift the nature of governance from being tribal to actually being a centralized government. That as long as we have identities of 12 tribes and each tribe has their own individual responsibility of when to bring the taxes to the king to support the king, well, we maintain a lot of independence. And this has always been the balance, lahavdil, we've had in the United States. Okay, between, if you think about the early years of George Washington, between the independence the states felt and the responsibilities that there were for a federal government, and the responsibilities the federal government had, for example, in the early years of the United States, in creating, for instance, a central bank. The fact that there was a central bank shifted the balance of power. This also apparently, Shlomo HaMelech is trying to shift that power as well. באמת הריכוזית מתבקשת העדפת חלוקה גיאוגרפית לפי צרכים כלכליים וביטחוניים על חלוקה השבטית המסורתית. And he says what he's doing is he's ultimately reorganizing the people around economic and military needs. That if they have this kind of organization, it'll be better, which explains, if it's economic, it explains the gerrymandering that occurs. For example, back in this area of Megiddo, okay, that why it's such a strange place. They needed that kind of space. And it also could even explain all of the large regions that were done as well versus the small regions. Shlomo HaMelech now, if you think about his position, this is the parak, his position is very, very simple. What he has done is he has won over the hearts of the Jewish people. He has convinced them that he will be their king and over them as the king. And at the very same time, what he has successfully done now is created an agenda. His agenda is a domestic agenda seen by the position of the ministers, and his agenda is an economic defensive agenda and defense agenda versus one of war, which had been what his father, David HaMelech, had done until now. With that, we are actually finished with the parak. I am going to ask this question, and I know it's not as much of an imposition when you come in on a Zoom. If you want to do this Chol Hamoed, I'm okay with it. I'm not going anywhere. But if you want to take a break for Chol Hamoed, I also understand. Sid votes no.
I vote yes.
Votes yes.
Yes.
Ready? Yes.
Seymour votes yes.
Yes.
Okay. So what we'll do is, as always,
I vote yes too.
Okay, I will record this. If you can't make it, I'll record it. You'll be able to watch it. Also, I want to wish a mazel tov to my mother. She just had another great-grandson while this call was called to give us the news. So hopefully, Elisheva beat me to telling my mother in public about all of the... Yafa, yes.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Moshe Garcia's comment, if we can go back for a minute.
Please.
By preserving those particular shvatim, was there some strategy there, according to Garcia? Because these were some sort of formative, influential kinds of tribal people that are, these tribes were preserving Benjamin as part of Shaul HaMelech's
Right, so
ancestry, and I don't know about Naphtali, but and Yisachar, maybe because they're learning, but and Ephraim, I mean, ultimately that's where
that's what's really broken up. What's interesting, so Garcia doesn't mention it.
He does not.
No, Alex Israel does. Interesting. And Alex Israel's piece suggests, and I'm going to go back to the map for a moment. Hold on a second. If I can share. Alex Israel's piece suggests that part of this area here is Yosef. The Har Ephraim, this area here is Yosef.
Right.
That actually he wanted to break up Yosef a little bit.
Right.
Because Yosef, if you remember, would be portenders to the throne. That would be ultimately Yeravam is coming from that area. Binyamin, he doesn't address. I haven't seen it addressed. I would guess that Binyamin is because of the close alliances with Yehuda and Binyamin, even though Shaul was from Binyamin, that maybe there was a reason to keep Binyamin together, but that doesn't seem to address it all. What Garcia addresses is just the meta question of why reorganize? Why not just keep the Shvatim and say, hey, Yisachar, you're responsible for Nisan, Naphtali, you're responsible for, Sivan, et cetera, down the road. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, et cetera, down the road. And that he addresses just the big picture. I haven't seen anything further on it. I think it's a fascinating piece that's been addressed.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do is that next week, same time, same place, wherever you're at, bring your own coffee, and we will continue their learning. And please God, everyone will stay safe and stay healthy.
And Rabbi
everybody.
Yes, what? Yafa?
It's always the same meeting number, meeting code, and always the same ID.
It'll always be until the company changes it. So
Okay.
if there's a change, you will definitely get an email from me. And if there's no change, I will still try to send out a reminder after Shabbos before the shiur starts.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Chag Hashem v'Sameach, everyone.
Okay,